A July morning in 1944, at the Boeing plant in Seattle, Martha, a young American factory worker, began her shift as usual. Her job was to inspect the fuel system on B-17 bombers nearing completion. The same familiar fittings, the same bolts to tighten. But that day, something made her pause. One bolt, which at first glance looked perfectly normal, seemed, based on Martha's experience, just a bit too short. Only a small difference, but enough to make the fuel line slightly loose, and if a leak occurred mid-air, a single spark could set the entire bomber on fire. Martha removed the bolt. Her hands were still greasy, but her mind was focused on one thing. This couldn't be ignored. And from that moment, a seemingly minor act ended up preventing a major disaster in the skies over Europe. In the middle of 1944, as World War II entered a fierce phase, the skies over Europe were filled with targets for the B-17 bombers. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a symbol of American air power, a heavy bomber capable of carrying thousands of kilograms of bombs, flying long distances, and known for its durability. However, from its early days, the B-17 had encountered serious issues. The first 400 aircraft crashed during landing because pilots confused the wing flap lever with the landing gear controls. Boeing later had to redesign the control panel to correct this flaw. In total, Boeing produced 12,731 B-17 seconds between 1,936 and 1,945, enabling the Allies to unleash an enormous volume of bombs during the war. These aircraft dropped millions of tons of bombs on Axis targets, accounting for over 42% of all Allied bomb tonnage dropped on Germany. At the Boeing plant in Seattle in 1944, among thousands of women working around the clock to assemble B-17 bombers, there was a young woman named Martha. She was not an engineer, but with skillful hands and sharp eyes, she was assigned one of the most precision-demanding tasks, inspecting the fuel system. Every day, Martha climbed onto a wooden platform, crawled inside the wing of the bomber, drill in hand, eyes focused on every joint. Amid the noise of machinery and the constant pressure of deadlines, she worked quietly and steadily. To Martha, every bolt, every fuel line was connected to the lives of the crew on board. A small mistake could mean the end in the sky. For her, absolute precision was not just a routine, it was a matter of survival. That day, the weather in Seattle was hotter than usual. Heat rose from the concrete floor, mixing with the smell of oil and metal, making the factory air more suffocating than ever. As usual, Martha was performing the final check on a nearly completed B-17. The fuselage, cockpit, and bomb bay were all assembled. What remained was ensuring that the fuel system inside the wings was connected exactly as required. It was a task she had done hundreds of times, connecting fuel lines, tightening bolts, checking seals, making sure there were no leaks under pressure. But she never worked like a machine. Martha always paid close attention to the smallest details, and that was exactly what made the difference that morning. As she leaned in, the pale yellow light from the overhead industrial lamp shone down onto the metal surface, casting shimmering reflections like ripples on water. Under her firm yet skillful hands, the wrench turned smoothly around the fitting. She was tightening the final bolt, securing a fuel pipe in place. Everything was going as it always did, until her fingers sensed something that felt not quite right. The bolt felt shorter than usual. At first, it was only a faint impression, like a tailor noticing a slightly misaligned stitch or a musician hearing a wrong note. But Martha stopped. She held the bolt up and compared it with the ones she used every day. She was right. It was shorter, just a little. But in a fuel system, even a little could be dangerous. In the span of a few seconds, her mind raced through every possibility. If the shorter bolt didn't hold the pipe tightly, it could come loose. And if the plane was already in the air, pressure at altitude would force fuel out, a drop of gasoline, a spark of static electricity, and the B-17 could become a fireball, taking all 10 crew members with it. The sounds of welding, metal cutting, and shouted instructions from nearby scaffolds still filled the air, but to Martha, everything went silent. In that moment, it was just her and the small bolt lying in the palm of her hand. Without hesitation, she removed it and set it aside. Then, from her personal toolbox, she took out another bolt, one that met proper specifications and was a few millimeters longer. Martha inserted it into the same fitting and gently tightened it. When she felt that familiar, secure tension, she let out a breath. Sweat was dripping down her face, but her hands stayed firmly on the joint. She leaned in one last time, inspecting every gap, every seam. Everything had to be perfect. She knew that if she ignored this detail, no one else would notice. The plane would be delivered, and it might never come back. After replacing the bolt and checking the joint carefully, Martha still didn't feel at ease. She looked over the entire system once more, from connection points to every section of the pipeline. Everything seemed in order, but the unease didn't go away. Her instinct, something she had come to trust after hundreds of hours inside the wings of these aircraft, was still ringing like a warning bell. She knew this wasn't just an isolated mistake. If one incorrect bolt had made it into the process, there could be dozens, maybe even hundreds just like it, quietly waiting inside B-17 seconds, about to leave the factory. And if not caught in time, the consequences could be unimaginable. Without hesitation, Martha went to her direct supervisor, Mr. Thomas Reed, a seasoned engineer known for his strict standards, but also for listening to his team. She found him in the inspection office at the far end of the workshop, under the warm yellow light of an old desk lamp. Martha laid out every detail of what she had just discovered. She spoke about the bolt, but also described the loose feeling in the joint as she tightened it, the difference in length, and the potential for vibration once the aircraft was in flight. Then she pointed to the fuel system diagram hanging on the wall, explaining where the bolt sat in the pressure cycle and what could happen if pressure exceeded tolerance at that weak point. At first, Reed seemed hesitant. For a man with his experience, a slightly incorrect bolt, usually counted as a minor issue among thousands of parts handled each day. But Martha's eyes didn't waver. She wasn't speaking on impulse. Her explanation was logical, well-grounded, and delivered with a seriousness that demanded attention. Reed nodded. He suggested they inspect another B-17 that was nearing completion. They picked a nearby aircraft, pulled a portable light over, and climbed onto the platform to begin checking. Under the cold white light, they removed the bolts at the corresponding location. Martha carefully pointed out what had raised her concern: slight looseness in the fitting, uneven marks in the metal details that would be easy to miss for anyone without a trained touch. Reed inserted a longer bolt into the exact same position, then used a feeler gauge and torque wrench to compare results. The difference was clear. The joint was tighter, there was no more play, and when they simulated pressure, the system performed safely, nearly at the optimal design specification. Reed was silent for a few seconds. Then he straightened up, looked at Martha, and said in a serious tone, "You're right, this isn't a small issue." The very next morning, Reed personally reported the case to the senior technical department. When the shop manager, Mr. Reginald Harris, received Reed's memo, he frowned. Harris was well known for his focus on deadlines and efficiency. Halting the assembly line because of a bolt discrepancy didn't sound like an easy call, especially during a time when dozens of B-17 seconds had to be finished each day to meet deployment schedules. But Reed didn't just file a report. He laid out the full results of their inspection, including technical measurements and the potential implications for flight safety. More importantly, he emphasized that if this error went unaddressed, it wouldn't just affect a single aircraft. It could trigger a chain of failures, a hidden system-wide flaw waiting to activate. At that, Harris fell silent. Then he gave a clear and firm order. All related assembly lines were to be halted immediately. Every B-17 that had received its fuel system installation that week was to be re-inspected. A factory-wide emergency review had begun, all because of a single bolt spotted by a young woman on the floor. Just hours after the order was issued, the atmosphere inside the Boeing plant changed completely. What had been a race to meet deadlines now shifted into emergency inspection mode. Technical teams were formed on the spot, divided by shift and by aircraft group. Veteran mechanics were paired with design engineers to review every B-17 at risk of the defect. The factory floor grew heavier not from heat, but from tension. Everyone understood. Had Martha not caught the issue, the consequences would have been dire. In the wing assembly area, workers climbed into fuel compartments, pried open temporary panels, and got to work. The shriek of drills, the clang of metal, the chatter of internal radio channels filled the air. Engineers gathered in clusters around technical diagrams spread across aluminum tables, holding calipers, pressure gauges, and hastily printed checklists. On the scaffolding, workers retightened each bolt, carefully reading the stamped codes on every fastener. Any bolt found to be shorter than spec was removed and replaced immediately. Every step was logged, every replacement signed off with care. This was no longer routine maintenance. This was now about protecting lives in the skies above Europe. Temperatures on the factory floor climbed throughout the day, but no one complained. Sweat soaked through shirts, dripped from brows, but not a single hand slowed down. No one allowed themselves to lose focus, not for a second. Each B-17 rechecked now felt like a soldier pulled back from the brink, saved, just in time, by a single bolt. The coordination between mechanics and engineers during those critical hours wasn't just part of the job. It was a quiet, determined effort to preserve the wings that would soon fly into enemy skies. And it was the clearest proof that, in war, what shifts the course of history isn't always a bomb sometimes. It's a worker brave enough to speak up when no one else does. In less than 3 weeks after the flaw was first discovered, the entire B-17 production line at Boeing had been reviewed from top to bottom. More than 100 bombers in late stages of assembly were reopened and their wing fuel joints inspected. Dozens of suspicious bolts were removed in bulk and replaced with certified parts that met exact torque and length specifications, each individually coded and tested. The response didn't stop there. Boeing's engineers quickly issued a technical alert to all air bases that had recently received B-17 bombers from the affected production batches. Every squadron was instructed to inspect the fuel systems on active aircraft, while replacement components were shipped immediately for on-site upgrades. Maintenance crews at home worked around the clock, and several technical teams were even deployed directly to forward bases in Europe to assist with inspections and corrective actions. Major squadrons like the 8th and 100th Bomb Groups, which had shouldered a large portion of deep penetration bombing missions over Germany, were among the first to receive the updated parts and procedures. From inside the cockpits, flight commanders were briefed on the issue, how a tiny detail could have led to disaster, and more importantly, how it had been caught just in time. They understood clearly that their aircraft were now safer, more precise thanks to a factory worker whose name they did not know. In the missions that followed, when landing gear finally touched the runway after long and dangerous flights, many pilots stepped off their planes and offered thanks not only to the ground crews at their bases, but also to the invisible hands behind the assembly lines back home, because they knew full well that if one small oversight had gone unnoticed, they might not have returned. By the end of 1944, Boeing submitted an internal report to the War Department, classifying the discovery and resolution of the faulty bolts as a critical safety improvement. Not all game-changing decisions are grand. Some begin with a simple act, made at the right moment, by the right person. Estimates suggested that, had the flaw not been discovered in time, at least several dozen missions could have suffered mid-air malfunctions. With each B-17 carrying 10 crew members, the potential loss of life would have been in the hundreds. But now, the flying fortresses continued to take off in waves, delivering thousands of tons of bombs onto Axis strongholds. Missions made possible, in part, by a bolt that had been caught before it was too late. By the time the war came to an end, B-17 seconds alone had dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs on Germany, accounting for more than 42% of the total bomb tonnage delivered by Allied forces in the region. Those aircraft, which might have been doomed by a minor assembly flaw instead, helped reshape the course of the war. And among the millions of mechanical parts that kept these great warbirds flying, there was one slightly too short bolt that didn't escape the eyes of a worker named Martha. From the moment she stopped her hand, an entire squadron was quietly saved. Martha was not a name everyone knew. She didn't wear a uniform, didn't go to the battlefield, and didn't appear in the photos that marked victory. The only things she carried each day were a toolbox, a pair of worn gloves, and a belief that the work she was doing, no matter how small, could affect the life of someone, somewhere, halfway across the world. She didn't need anyone to remind her to be careful. She didn't work for praise or reward. She did it because she understood. One loose fitting could be the line between life and death. One wrong bolt could be the reason an entire crew never returned. And in the moment she chose not to overlook something seemingly minor. Hundreds of lives were preserved even if they never knew her name. Years after the war, when B-17 pilots were asked about the moments they narrowly escaped death, many didn't speak about their own bravery. They spoke of the silent workers behind the scenes. They never saw a face, never shook a hand, but they knew the planes that brought them home were the result of unseen dedication. In a letter kept in a military archive, one pilot once wrote, "Maybe I'm alive today because someone at Boeing double-checked something." Perhaps that someone was Martha. Perhaps she never knew who she had saved, but that only made her actions more meaningful because she did the right thing without ever needing to know the outcome. Victory in World War II didn't come only from brilliant generals, advanced weaponry, or decisive battles. It was built by millions of ordinary people like Martha, people behind the lines, without guns or medals, who still refused to let mistakes pass. In a world shaped by bombs and cold steel, where everything could collapse from a single oversight, there were still workers whose hands held the line, who kept the standard, the discipline, and the lives of those flying on the edge of death. Maybe Martha returned to a normal life after the war. Maybe she quietly left the factory when the assembly lines shut down. But the legacy she left behind without statues or awards still lives on in every plane that landed safely, in every soldier who lived to tell the story. No one builds monuments for bolts that fit just right, but sometimes it is the smallest things that keep an entire campaign from falling apart. And thanks to someone like Martha, that bolt held.